Welcome back to Obsession Engineering for another instalment of Henry's Honda SP1 Restoration, and the good news is the plating's come back, so I can put more stuff together. Yes! Look at all those gems. They used to be miserable and rusty and horrible, and now they're shiny and sparkly. How fabulous is that? Nice selection of different finishes, some more matte stuff down here, some nice black stuff, some shiny stuff over there, and some gold passivate over there. So that's excellent. Fairly quick turnaround on it as well. So now I think I'm going to start by putting the rear shock together. Stage one of the rebuild is to put the two bits of the body back together, the head and the tube. And because I'm going to Loctite that into there, while the Loctites are drying, I can then do the seal head. With the body screwed back together, it's time to move over to the vise, where I've got the shaft, the piston, the seal head and bits. And what I'm going to do is take it all apart so I can change the seals in the seal head. This bit is relatively straightforward. Undo the big nut at the top, slide everything off in order, laying it out on the sheet over there, make sure it's all nice and clean, take the seal head off, and then we'll split that apart. The point to note is this thread at the top of the shaft is actually pinned over by the manufacturers so that the nut can't come off. And it's a sensible solution because they don't really expect you to take it apart and service it. So what you have to do is just grind the very top thread off, and then I actually run a die nut down here as well, just to make sure all the thread's nice and clear so the new nut will go on. When I replace it, I will fit a locking nut, and I tend to Loctite them as well. You can also see the tip of the bypass needle. So that feeds down here and into this hole. So that is the bypass circuit that runs past the shim stack, which allows you to adjust the shock. This is the seal head. Called that because, well, it's got seals in it. You can see one seal there, there's actually another seal just down the hole down there, and there's a bush. I'm going to be changing the seals and the bush, and this outer seal on here, so I'm just going to case of popping the old seals off, knocking the bush out, drifting a new bush in, popping it all back together with new bits. So here's the elements of the seal head: the outer seal, bush, some washers, the inner seal, some more washers, and the sort of bump stop seal, I suppose you'd call it. And what I've done there is just knocked the old bush out. A 10mm socket actually works very well for knocking that out. I do have the correct driver for knocking the new one in. I also have new seals and bits. Everything's from K-Tech, available from B&C Express. So I'm just going to pop that back together, and then that bit can go back on the shaft. What I'm going to try and do here is illustrate how much adjustment this bypass makes. So at the moment, the bypass is all the way open, so you'd flow the maximum oil away from the shim stack. As you can see there, you get a nice little jet of fluid through. That's with it fully open. If I close the adjuster off, that's wound the needle all the way into the end of the bypass. You still get a tiny bit through it, but nowhere near as much. Now that I've got the new seals and bushes fitted, I've refitted the seal head with a good smear of Motul shock oil on everything so it slides together quite nicely, being really careful that we don't nick anything on any sharp edges. So now, stage by stage, I shall put all the shims and the piston back on, making sure everything is meticulously clean as we go along. This is the piston through which the oil flows to then push the shims out of the way. So, as the piston moves one way or the other, the oil will go through one set of holes, say these recessed holes here, which come out here, and these spaces here are sort of sealed against the shim, against this shim, and so as the oil passes through, what it has to do is actually try and bend the shim out the way. So obviously the softer the shim, the softer the damping, or the more oil you bypass, the softer the damping. And when it goes the other way, it goes back through the hole that side, back through these holes, against the other set of shims. So that's the new seals and new bushes fitted into the seal head. The piston is rebuilt, new locking nut and everything. Everything's meticulously cleaned. So hopefully you can see, even with the fingernail, you can just bend the shims out of the way. So you can imagine the oil pressure pushing that up and just flexing the shims out of the way, and that's what gives you your damping. So obviously when people talk about revalving, they're altering either the diameter or the thickness of the shims, and that alters the damping characteristic. The next stage is to pop the bladder back in, so I'm just going to grease this end of it, and then I'll slide that back into the reservoir, and then I can pump a little bit of pressure in that, and then I can start pouring oil in. I've got the bladder in and I've pumped it with just a few psi just to expand it so it's taking up the correct amount of space. I actually use a bicycle shock pump initially, just so I'm not using my nitrogen reserves on stuff we're actually going to let out in a bit. I've also poured some lovely motor oil in. It's proper shock oil, so I've poured that in and I've wiggled it around plenty to make sure there's no air bubbles, and it's nearly at the top, but obviously when I put the piston in, it's going to take up some of that room and push some of the oil out. So the next thing to do is pop the piston in and try not to lose too much oil, and then I've got to stroke it up and down to get any air out of it. Bleeding the air out of the oil can take quite a long time. What I also do on occasions is lock off the bypass and then tap the top of the shock with a hammer, and that moves the piston fast enough that it forces the shims open so that any air trapped in the piston is pushed out. So all in all, it does take a while. Now that I've finally managed to bleed all the air out of the oil, what I need to do is obviously knock the seal head down into the shock body so it seals. So as I do that, obviously it's going to displace some of the oil, so we'll have a little bit spill out the top, which is good because it means that's not pushing any air in, but also at the same time I then have to release a little bit of pressure out the bladder. But then once I've pushed this down far enough, I can pop the circlip in and then actually put the gas in. Now that I've got the shock regassed and sealed up, I'm just going to do a couple of little push tests to make sure everything's working as it should do. So the first one is with all the adjusters fully wide open. As you can see, it still takes a reasonable effort to push the shaft in, and it pops back under the gas pressure all on its own, so that's good. The next test is to close the rebound adjuster, which does a little bit of everything, and as you can see, that's considerably harder to push in. And comes back very, very slowly on its own. But if I open the bypass, it comes back considerably quicker. And the last test is just to close the compression damper adjuster off. And that gives us a bit of adjustment compared to having the bypass just open, but it's not as much adjustment as the bypass gives, which sort of makes sense from what we've seen earlier. So I'd say that's happy days. I can put the spring back on. So I have my newly powder coated spring in place with my newly plated preload adjusters. So all I've got to do is compress the spring enough to get the stopper plates in, the little collets. So I'll pump the spring compressor up just so it pushes the shock through, compresses the spring, slip the collets in, and that's the shock finished. And there we have it, the finished article with a new end cap, which is actually a core plug, which happens to be the right size. So that's just tapped into place, and that looks absolutely stunning compared to what came out the bike. Thanks for watching, and join me again next time for more SP1 fun.